Every single time Washington decides to go to war in the Middle East, it tells itself the same story. It tells itself that it is acting from a position of strength, that it controls the chessboard, that it holds all the pieces that matter. And every single time, the world shifts underneath its feet in ways that the architects of that war never anticipated, never planned for, and never truly understood. What you are watching unfold right now in the aftermath of the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran is not just another Middle East conflict. It is not just another chapter of bombs and body counts and ceasefire negotiations. What you are watching is a fundamental seismic, possibly irreversible restructuring of who controls the global energy game. And here is the brutal, uncomfortable truth that most of your mainstream media will not sit down and explain to you clearly. After the U.S. and Israel launched airstrikes against Iran in late February of this year, the Iranian military effectively barricaded the Strait of Hormuz, cutting off about 1/5 of global oil and natural gas supply. 1/5. Think about that for a second. One choke point, one narrow strip of water, and the entire global economy began to shudder. But while Washington was busy congratulating itself on its military operations, while the networks were running their maps and their graphics and their expert panels, something else was happening quietly and systematically in the background. China was winning, and China was winning on every single front simultaneously in ways that should keep every serious American strategist up at night. Let's start with what most people already know, but haven't fully processed in its strategic depth. Approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports end up in China. 90%. That's not a trade relationship. That's a lifeline. That's a dependency so deep, so structural, so deliberately cultivated over years of patient Chinese diplomacy and deal-making that it effectively means Beijing has had a private pipeline running through the most sanctioned nation on earth, right under the nose of the United States Treasury, right under the watch of every sanctions regime Washington has constructed. China's oil imports hit record highs in 2025, reaching 11.55 million barrels per day, with over 55% of those imports coming from the Middle East. Record highs. While America was tightening sanctions, China was quietly importing more oil than it ever had in its history. And the number that should genuinely stun you is this. China reported roughly $31.2 billion in unreported Iranian crude oil exports in 2025 alone, which, if included, comprise over 75% of total bilateral trade between the two countries. Unreported. That means the full scale of this relationship has been deliberately obscured, routed through third countries, disguised through ship-to-ship transfers, and structured in ways specifically designed to avoid American financial surveillance. China didn't just find a workaround to American power. China built an entire parallel energy architecture designed from the ground up to make American sanctions irrelevant. Now let's talk about what's happening right now, because this is where things get genuinely historic. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz, it didn't shut it for everyone equally. Tehran said that Chinese tankers are allowed to pass through the oil transit choke point unimpeded. Read that sentence again. Iranian ships guarding the most important maritime passage in the world waved Chinese tankers through. While the rest of the global shipping industry was paralyzed, while oil prices were surging past $100 a barrel for the first time in years, Chinese energy supply was being protected at the source by the very nation conducting the blockade. That is not an accident. That is the product of years of strategic relationship building. That is what it looks like when a country plays the long game while its rivals are playing checkers. But here is where it gets even more profound, and this is the dimension that will define the next 30 years of global power. An Iranian government official told CNN that tankers can have permission to travel through the Strait of Hormuz if they agree to sell oil in China's currency, the renminbi, not US dollars. There it is. There is the revolution hiding inside a war. Since 1974, since the historic agreement between Washington and Riyadh that was forged in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, the global oil market has operated on a single foundational principle. Oil is priced in dollars, oil is settled in dollars, and if you want energy, you need dollars. That arrangement created what economists call the petrodollar system, and that system has been the bedrock of American economic supremacy for over 50 years. It is the reason the United States can run permanent deficits without collapsing. It is the reason America can borrow more cheaply than any other nation on earth. It is the reason that when the world gets scared, it runs to the dollar. The dollar's dominance in cross-border trade is arguably built on the petrodollar. Globally traded oil is priced and invoiced in US dollars, and in exchange for Saudi Arabia recycling its dollars back into the US, Washington guaranteed the kingdom's security. That was the deal. Security for dollar supremacy. American military muscle protecting Gulf oil flows and Gulf petrodollars flowing back into American Treasury bonds, keeping American interest rates low and American power funded. And now that deal is cracking. Analysts believe that as Iran establishes yuan-based terms for oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, the conflict will change the dollar's status as the primary currency for global energy transactions. Deutsche Bank, one of the most serious financial institutions in the world, not some fringe publication, not some alternative media outlet, put out an assessment stating that the current conflict may expose fault lines by challenging the U.S. security umbrella for Gulf infrastructure and the maritime security for global trade in oil, and that this conflict could be remembered as a key catalyst for erosion in petrodollar dominance and the beginnings of the petroyuan. That is a mainstream Western financial institution telling you that what you are watching is not just a Middle East war, it is a monetary revolution. Now, let me be honest with you, because I think you deserve the full picture without spin in either direction. The yuan has real limitations. Unlike the dollar, the yuan is not freely convertible due to Beijing's strict capital controls, meaning that businesses and institutions cannot exchange it for other currencies or move it across borders at will. And right now, the dollar accounted for 57% of global foreign exchange reserve holdings, compared with about 20% for the euro and only 2% for the yuan, according to IMF data. So no, the dollar is not dead tomorrow. No one serious is saying that. What serious analysts are saying is that the trajectory has changed, the direction has shifted, and the Iran war didn't cause that shift. It accelerated it past the point of easy reversal. Consider the deeper structural picture. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell to 56.77% in 2025, its lowest level since the IMF began tracking the data in 1995. Lowest level since 1995. Central banks around the world have been diversifying quietly, methodically, away from the dollar for years. They didn't announce it loudly. They didn't hold press conferences about it. They just did it. And the Iran conflict gave that process a new urgency, a new legitimacy, a new geopolitical cover. Because now when a country asks why it should hold fewer dollar reserves and explore alternatives, Iran has given them a very concrete, very real, very operational answer. Because a Chinese tanker sailed through the Strait of Hormuz while your tanker sat waiting. That's a demonstration of power that no speech at the United Nations can replicate. Let's now turn to the dimension that has received almost no serious coverage in American media, and that is China's clean energy dominance. This is the second front in China's energy game, and it may ultimately be more consequential than the oil relationship. China dominates renewable energy supply chains, producing a vast majority of the world's solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. And when the Strait of Hormuz closed and oil prices exploded, what happened? Countries that had been slowly, cautiously moving toward clean energy suddenly had a crisis-level incentive to move fast. And when they moved fast, they had only one place to go. China exported 68 gigawatts of solar technology in March, surpassing the previous record set in August by 50%, and 50 countries set new records for Chinese solar imports, with the most significant growth coming from emerging markets in Asia and Africa, hit hardest by the energy crisis. 50 countries setting new records simultaneously, because the fossil fuel supply shock didn't just create energy insecurity, it created a global sales event for Chinese clean technology, and China was fully stocked, fully prepared, and fully positioned to meet every single order. Ember said exports of solar, batteries, and EVs in total rose 70% in March year over year, according to Chinese customs data, 70% in a single month. China's battery exports reached $10 billion in March, with particularly high growth rates in the European Union, Australia, and India. Think about that geography. The European Union, which has been America's closest ally in confronting China economically, was buying Chinese batteries at record pace because the Iran war made fossil fuels too expensive and too unreliable. Australia, which has been at the center of Western efforts to contain Chinese economic influence in the Indo-Pacific, was setting records for Chinese solar imports. India, the country that American strategists have been courting for years as a counterweight to Chinese regional power, was buying Chinese clean technology at unprecedented levels. Chinese exports of electric vehicles and hybrids hit a record high in March, increasing 140% compared with the same period a year ago. 140% in 1 year. Because of a war that American military planners thought would assert dominance, the entire global EV market turned toward Beijing. And here is what makes this truly strategic, not just commercial. China has been regarded as a low-cost supplier, but is increasingly treated as a long-term partner in the energy transition. That is the shift you need to understand. When you move from vendor to partner, you move from someone you buy from to someone you build with. You move from a transactional relationship to a structural one. And structural relationships in energy translate directly into geopolitical alignment. Pakistan is the clearest example of this dynamic. Pakistan has been spared some of the impact from the war since it began drastically importing cheap Chinese solar panels a few years ago, and using solar energy rather than costly oil imports is estimated to save the country billions of dollars each year. While Pakistan's neighbors are scrambling for fuel, while energy ministers across South Asia are holding emergency meetings, Pakistan is insulated because it made a strategic bet on Chinese clean energy years before the crisis hit. That is the power of the long game, and China has been playing the long game while Washington has been playing the news cycle. Now let's bring Russia into this picture, because you cannot understand China's energy position in 2026 without understanding how Beijing has used the entire architecture of Western sanctions to its advantage. Russia has seen a windfall from the Iran war as Middle East energy supplies have been impacted, prompting major buyers India and China to significantly increase imports, massively boosting Russia's fossil fuel export revenues. In the first quarter of 2026, 90% of Russia's total exports of crude were delivered to China and India. Think about what that means. The two most sanctioned major energy producers in the world, Russia and Iran, are both channeling the overwhelming majority of their output to a small number of buyers, and China is at the center of that network. China is buying discounted Russian oil. China was buying discounted Iranian oil. China is now effectively the clearinghouse for the world's sanctioned energy, buying cheap and building leverage simultaneously. And here is the strategic genius of Beijing's position that I want you to genuinely sit with for a moment. China is not taking sides in the Iran war in any way that costs it anything. Moscow and Beijing have both condemned the blockade preventing ships from entering and exiting Iranian ports. Diplomatically, China is on record opposing the conflict, but operationally, economically, structurally, China is profiting from every single dimension of it. It's getting discounted oil from Iran while that oil is unavailable to the rest of the world. It's getting discounted oil from Russia to compensate for any shortfalls. It's selling record volumes of solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles to countries desperately seeking energy alternatives. And it's using the Strait of Hormuz crisis to normalize yuan-denominated oil transactions in a way that would have taken a decade to achieve organically. Every aspect of this conflict has strengthened China's position, and none of it required China to fire a single shot. The conflict has created a strategic setback for Washington in the Gulf region, with Iran having gained control over the Strait of Hormuz, which enables Iran to decide which ships will navigate through the waterway, and the U.S. failure to ensure security in the Gulf could unwind the premise on which the petrodollar is built. That is the fundamental reversal that American policymakers need to come to terms with. The entire petrodollar system, the entire architecture of American financial supremacy, was built on one promise: that the United States would guarantee the security of Gulf energy flows. That was the deal. That was the foundation. And for the first time since 1974, that promise is visibly, demonstrably not being kept. Iranian forces are still operating in the strait. Tankers are still being seized. The ceasefire that's been negotiated is fragile and contested, and the world has taken note. Not just Iran and China, but every Gulf state, every energy importer, every central bank that has been quietly wondering for years whether dollar diversification was a viable option is now watching in real time as the American security guarantee reveals its limits. Gulf states might reduce their dollar-denominated foreign asset investments because economic losses from the Gulf will impact their merchandise value. The recycling of petrodollars back into American Treasury bonds, that mechanism which has kept American borrowing costs low and American power funded for half a century, that mechanism depends on Gulf states feeling secure, feeling prosperous, feeling confident in the American umbrella. That confidence has been shaken, not destroyed overnight. These are complex relationships with deep institutional roots, but shaken. And in geopolitics, doubt is the beginning of defection. What we are witnessing right now is China executing a strategy that has been decades in the making. Beijing never needed to win a military confrontation with the United States to shift the balance of global power. It needed to build enough alternative infrastructure, enough alternative relationships, enough alternative financial architecture that when a crisis came, the world would have somewhere else to turn. And the Iran war has proven that it does. China, which already dominates global supply chains for solar and wind power, batteries, and EVs, now faces another opportunity to further its reach. Years of capacity building, often at the expense of profitability, have enabled Chinese manufacturers to scale up distribution in overseas markets quickly and competitively, making green products a new growth driver for the country's exports. That phrase, often at the expense of profitability, is the key to understanding how China built this position. Beijing was willing to lose money for years, to subsidize industries, to undercut competitors, to flood markets with cheap products, not because it was trying to make a profit in the short term, but because it was trying to own the infrastructure of the future. And now the future has arrived and China owns it. The American political debate about China tends to focus on tariffs, on trade deficits, on intellectual property theft, on Taiwan. These are real issues. They deserve serious attention. But while Washington has been arguing about tariffs and decoupling, China has been building the physical infrastructure of global energy transition. While Congress has been holding hearings about TikTok, China has been signing 25-year energy partnership agreements with countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. In 2021, China pledged up to $400 billion in investment over 25 years as part of a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Iran. $400 billion in one country over 25 years. That is not a trade deal. That is a civilizational commitment. That is China saying to Iran and to every country watching, we are here for the long run. We are not coming and going based on election cycles. We are not going to sanction you the next time we disagree politically. We are your partner. And that message has resonated across the developing world in ways that American foreign policy has consistently underestimated. Because what China is offering is not just cheap solar panels or discounted oil. It is an alternative to the American model of engagement, which too often has come packaged with conditions, with sanctions, with regime change rhetoric, with the implicit or explicit threat that if you don't align with Washington's values and Washington's interests, the financial system will be weaponized against you. For Tehran and Beijing, elevating the yuan is a win-win, as the use of the currency allows China and Iran to skirt U.S. sanctions imposed via the dollar-dominated financial system, and it simplifies and reduces the cost of trade between the sides, which has boomed under a 25-year strategic partnership signed in 2021. For the countries sitting on the fence, watching this unfold, the appeal of an alternative financial system is not ideological. It is practical. It is about having options. It is about not being one tweet, one executive order, one sanctions regime away from having your economy throttled. The question that Americans need to be asking, the honest question, is not whether China is playing this well, because it clearly is. The question is whether the United States is capable of the kind of strategic patience, the kind of long-term thinking, the kind of coherent, multi-decade planning that China has demonstrated in building this position. Because what you're watching in real time is not China cheating. China is not violating any rules that America itself didn't write. China is doing exactly what a rising power does when it sees an opportunity. It builds relationships, it creates dependencies, it positions itself at the center of the systems that matter most, and it waits for the moment when those systems become indispensable. That moment is now. The Iran conflict has not created China's energy dominance. It has simply made it visible to those who are still choosing not to see it.